Hello there, Canada Files viewers. This is Aidan Jonah, editor-in-chief of the Canada Files, bringing back the Speaker Series. I am here for episode 8, and we are here with Charlotte Cates, the international coordinator of the Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. Charlotte, thanks for joining Canada Files.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to join you at a great anti-imperialist outlet like the Canada Files.
Thank you very much. So, can you start by telling the audience how you got involved in the Palestinian liberation movement? Like what events triggered you to get involved?
Well, just this note, like on a personal level, I was a university student during what's often called the Second Intifada, the Al-Aqsa Intifada. And this was a time period in the late, specifically the Intifada erupted in September 2000, but I was a university student in the late 90s, early 2000s. And this was a time in which the Palestinian cause had been kind of portrayed for several years since 1993 and the so-called Oslo Accords, the so-called peace process, had been portrayed as being on some kind of a track to resolution under the auspices of US domination, US hegemony, and US leadership, i.e., US imperialism. And there was a large actually amount of repression that was taking place against the Palestinian movement, but it was kind of the news was suppressed and it was a little bit hidden under the covers of what the US was doing at that time. Now, of course, this is the period after the first US war in Iraq. This is the period after the fall of the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc in Eastern Europe. And it was a very difficult period of time, but it was also a period of rising revolt, especially in Palestine, particularly as the so-called Oslo Accords had failed to achieve any of their stated goals for the Palestinian people. Instead of achieving any kind of sovereignty, independence, or statehood, Palestinians were instead facing an increasing number of settlements, an increasing number of attacks, no actual meaningful progress, and just further subjugation, more land theft, more colonization. And so in the year 2000, 7 years after the Oslo Accords, 6 years after the creation of the so-called Palestinian National Authority, and really also only 4 months after the liberation of the south of Lebanon from Zionist occupation by the Lebanese resistance led by Hezbollah, there was an eruption in occupied Palestine that was the development of Al-Aqsa Intifada, the Second Intifada. And this was something that drew the support and attention of people around the world. I was already involved in progressive anti-imperialist politics, doing solidarity work with the Philippines or Venezuela. And of course, as someone who was in that milieu, I saw Palestine as another anti-imperialist struggle that was important to support, to stand with. And at this moment, it became incredibly urgent to do organizing around Palestine. And this was happening on campuses across the United States at the same time, actually. We often think about the student intifada that's happening now in terms of the demand for universities to divest. But probably the first current century divest from Israel conference focused on students took place in Berkeley, California in 2001. I'm speaking about North America here. It was only months after the development of this intifada. There were protests happening. I went to school at Rutgers University in New Jersey. There were protests happening all the time in Paterson and Clifton in New York City. And we would attend, and we were also talking about, how are we going to start a Palestine solidarity group at our university? How are we going to get involved? What can we do here? We have an anti-imperialist alliance. How are we going to organize around this? Of course, within the next year was also September 11th and the US war drive toward Afghanistan, toward Iraq. And we were, the entire movement at that time was so deeply immersed in a comprehensive kind of struggle and organizing, whether it's on campus and in our communities, against domestic repression, against against domestic oppression, against this kind of Islamophobia, anti-Arab, anti-Muslim, extreme racism and repression that was taking place across the United States, against the US invasion of Afghanistan, against the impending US war in Iraq, and against the ongoing Zionist colonization and occupation in Palestine, and in support of the Palestinian people and their resistance. And so, I think being in university at this time, at this like very critical moment, it was extremely clear, as someone who was dedicated to confronting US imperialism and struggling against it, that looking at Palestine, that this was something that was absolutely central to the US imperialist project. And that this is a place where the Palestinian people have been engaging in a dedicated and determined struggle and a powerful and brave and resilient resistance for the past, now it's 75 years, against Zionist colonialism, and really over 100 years against British colonialism, that particularly for those of us that want to fight imperialism here, that one of the things that's most essential for any of us to do is to stand with the Palestinian people, stand with the resistance, and do whatever we can to build the movement here to weaken the Zionist project and the imperialist project, and to support the resistance in its work of liberating Palestine.
Thanks, Charlotte. So I want to know about this. So how do you get into Canada in the first place? Because we'll get to this later. The question of you in Canada is a whole other controversy. So I think the audience would want to hear about that.
Yeah, just to say about coming to Canada, my husband is a Palestinian who is also a Canadian citizen. And so I should note that, like, from the early days of the student movement that I'm talking about, we were always coordinating with fellow students and organizers in Canada across North America. Because when we look at what Canadian imperialism looks like, it's pretty much always a partnership with US imperialism across the board. And so when we're organizing together, we're organizing to confront common enemies and common struggles. And so, it was in, I think it was 2001 to 2002, where Concordia University in Montreal was one of the central locations across North America for anti-Zionist organizing, for confronting Netanyahu and shutting him down. The student union was playing an amazing and important role at that time in confronting Zionism and imperialism in like a really comprehensive way in Canada. Like, those of us at Rutgers were taking the materials that Concordia was putting out and saying, how can we adapt these and use these at our university as well? The first time I went to a Palestine conference in Canada was in 2003, the Auda conference, and that's where I first met in person Caleb Barakat, who is now my husband and has been for 15 years. And so, we've always been, the Palestinian struggle is very transnational. And in many ways, this is because the Palestinian people themselves, the majority of Palestinians have been exiled from their homes and lands since al-Nakba in 1947 to 48, when Zionist forces essentially occupied and colonized 78% of Palestine and forced out Palestinians from hundreds of villages and cities, destroying villages, occupying cities, engaging in massacres. When we look at what's happening today in Gaza, in many ways, we see the attempt to have the same outcome of the Nakba of 1947 to 1948. That is, the ethnic cleansing, the genocide of Palestine and the Palestinian people. So everywhere that Palestinian people are, the Palestinian movement, and thus also the Palestine Solidarity movement, continues to grow. And so, you see Palestinians organizing alongside anti-imperialists and internationalists, alongside people in the Arab community. So it's a very internationalist movement. So, and especially confronting US and Canadian imperialism, which play very complementary roles in terms of Palestine. Our movement in North America has been coordinating with each other consistently. Not just since I got involved 20 some years ago, but for decades and decades and decades. So it's very natural to attend conferences in Toronto, to attend events, we hosted events in New York and brought speakers from Canada to come. But of course, there's also a personal dimension of this. And then, if you meet someone and you develop a political and personal relationship, then that's how you sometimes wind up coming to Canada or moving countries.
That's really interesting. So now I think the audience is going to want to know the tale of how you become the Samidoun Network's international coordinator, all the way back in November 2011. What's the story?
So, I mean, I just to be clear, like I moved to Canada in 2009. Caleb and I lived in Vancouver since then. And one of the things that, I mean, we're very involved in, building the boycott movement, organizing Palestine solidarity actions in Vancouver, organizing Palestine solidarity actions across North America. And one of the things that we identified as something that was missing at that time. And nowadays, I think it's a lot easier for people to get information in English, and there's a lot higher quality coverage in English of the struggle of Palestinian political prisoners. But one thing that we noted at that time was that there was actually very little information that was coming out in English on a regular basis about Palestinian prisoners. I should note also that I'm trained as a lawyer. I participated in a delegation to Palestine where we observed a portion of the military trial of Ahmed Sadat, the General Secretary of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, along with other international lawyers and activists. And so being part of the radical kind of legal community, the struggle of Palestinian prisoners and the struggle against colonial imprisonment is something that was always of great interest and a high priority in the work that I and many of my comrades did around Palestine. And this mirrored the commitment of the Palestinian people and the Palestinian resistance to the liberation of Palestinian political prisoners. When you look at Palestine, over 40% of Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem have spent some time in occupation prisons, whether being sentenced, being detained by soldiers or so-called border police, being held in administrative detention without charge or trial in ways that are indefinitely renewable. There isn't a family in occupied Palestine that hasn't been touched by political imprisonment. Even outside Palestine, when we look at the creation of these so-called anti-terror lists and anti-terror laws, there are Palestinian fathers in the United States serving 65-year sentences just for running charities for Palestine. So the issue of imprisonment as a weapon to maintain Zionist colonialism and imperialist hegemony in Palestine and throughout the Arab and Iranian region is something that was certainly of great interest, I think, to many of us, particularly in the radical legal community, but really across the board, especially seeing how fundamental this issue was as part of the Palestinian struggle, not just as like an isolated case or a human rights violation to stand off to the side, but that the weapon of imprisonment was a mechanism by which Zionist colonialism was maintained. And so therefore, fighting to end that imprisonment and free Palestinian political prisoners was central to achieving that goal, especially because those who are targeted for imprisonment are often leaders of the resistance movement, whether that's on a national level or in their local communities, in their villages, in their refugee camps, organizers of the student movement, of the women's movement, of the labor movement, people who organize land defense against settlers, people who take up arms and fight in the resistance. Across the board, those who are targeted for imprisonment are those who are leading the struggle for liberation. And so their liberation is central and necessary to achieve the liberation of Palestine. So one of the things that we noticed at that time, particularly, there was a major hunger strike taking place inside the Zionist prisons in 2011. This was a number of the leaders of the prisoners' movement and of the Palestinian liberation movement overall, such as Marwan Barghouti and Ahmed Sadat, were being held in isolation and solitary confinement. And hundreds of Palestinian prisoners were going on hunger strike to end their isolation, to end their solitary confinement. And most of the news that was coming out about this was only coming out in Arabic. It wasn't coming out in English. And there was no dedicated outlet to make sure that that information would be available in English or in other languages for people who were part of the global movement. And online translation tools were not as freely available nor as effective as they are today. They were much worse in quality and almost like unreadable, the output that they would put out. So we started Samidoun almost initially as to be a clearinghouse for the movement to provide information and resources so that people who are organizing for Palestine on their campuses, in their communities, people who were who watched the so-called Operation Cast Lead assault on Gaza in 2008 to 2009, people who saw the attacks on the Freedom Flotilla in 2010 and are outraged about the condition of Palestinians have the opportunity to also know about the struggle of the Palestinian prisoners and their leadership and their resistance for liberation in English. So it's in that context that Samidoun was launched at that time to create a platform of information. Of course, that hunger strike ended with the Wafala al-Ahrar prisoner exchange when the Palestinian resistance achieved the liberation of over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Israeli occupation soldier Gilad Shalit. And so that was essentially the end of this hunger strike, but it was also a moment when there were eyes around the world on the Palestinian prisoners, and people very much, particularly who were either part of this movement, who were part of anti-imperialist movements, who are part of progressive movements, wanted to know more about the Palestinian prisoners. And so this came about at that time. The second thing that was really essential to launching Samidoun was that around a month later, in December 2011, Khader Adnan, Sheikh Khader Adnan, who was now martyred during his fifth hunger strike in May 2023 in Zionist jails, had been detained and launched a hunger strike to win his freedom. He was being held under administrative detention without charge or trial. And this case really, I would say it sparked the attention of people around the world. And so we were really dedicated to providing information about his case, but also how his case fit into the broader context of the use of colonial imprisonment, first by the British and then by the Zionist regime as a mechanism of colonial control attacking the Palestinian people, and what our role can be internationally, particularly in the imperial core, in standing with the Palestinian prisoners and their resistance and confronting it. So essentially, Samidoun began as a way to translate and relay information to the broader movement. But what we found over the years was that people wanted to be part of this as an organization. They wanted to hold events. They wanted to be part of this. And so now we've developed into a truly international network with, over 20 chapters in 14 countries around the world.
So with your legal work with the National Lawyers Guild International Committee and International Association of Democratic Lawyers, your work there and Samidoun's work, I feel like it'll be very intertwined in the years afterwards of Samidoun's. So can you talk about that in a little more depth?
Sure. I would just say that this work is kind of mutually supportive, right? That like the National Lawyers Guild in the United States is the oldest racially integrated bar association in the United States. If you go to a demonstration in the US, you're going to see the legal observers wearing their green hats, and they're a part of the National Lawyers Guild. And I work with the International Committee, which is, because remember, I did my legal education and training in the United States, not in Canada. And so the International Committee sort of works on various anti-imperialist projects. Like most recently, the National Lawyers Guild internationally sent a delegation of election observers to Venezuela to observe the recent elections that took place, and were able to issue a report fundamentally like debunking these so-called allegations of fraud, by a variety of fascist right-wing forces within Venezuela, supported by Canadian, US, and European imperialists. But this has also meant, organizing delegations to Palestine, providing reports, doing advocacy, NLG lawyers go out there everywhere in the US and are actually often the people who are providing defense or representation to, for example, student protesters, thousands of whom have been arrested and rounded up and beaten by police on campuses across the United States in an attempt to suppress the movement for justice in Palestine, an attempt to suppress the growing student movement demanding that their universities and their complicity in Zionist occupation and fundamentally in US imperialism and the US war machine. So, NLG lawyers are kind of a part of the movement, are movement lawyers. And so, of course, being part of a movement and being part of the NLG, that's always like a very synergistic relationship that helps to that makes, I think, both parts stronger. That the NLG becomes stronger by being connected directly to grassroots movements, and grassroots movements become stronger by having access to a strong alliance of lawyers that are committed to clear principles on Palestine and on U.S. imperialism. And that's very much what the NLG International Committee is. The International Association of Democratic Lawyers is an international alliance of legal organizations, of lawyers, of legal workers that are in different countries around the world and that are all engaged, that are motivated by progressive values. The IADL has been around since the 1940s and has always, taken an anti-imperialist position, has always had has stood clearly on Palestine. I mean, the NLG didn't used to in the 1940s, but by the 1970s, it had, evolved dramatically. And the International Association of Democratic Lawyers was producing reports and documentation in the 1960s on Zionist colonialism in Palestine. And so, this is an international alliance. And so, if you look at there's work that takes place at the United Nations, there's work that takes place around the world that coordinates people who are lawyers basically in different parts of the world to come together to engage in radical, progressive, anti-imperialist movement lawyering on a collective level.
All right, Charlotte. So let's talk about the work of Samidoun over the years before we get to the attacks. So what have Samidoun's achievements been, say, over these past 12, 13 years?
Sometimes when we talk about Palestine solidarity work and the Palestinian prisoners' struggle, it can be difficult to point to clear achievements that you can necessarily say, oh, this is the work of this particular international solidarity organization. Because fundamentally, the struggle for Palestinian liberation is being led first and foremost by the Palestinian resistance, working hand in hand with their fellow forces of resistance in the region. At the same time, I would say that it's very clear that there is a much broader base of support for Palestine and that we've been a part of that. We're not the cause of that, but we're a part of that alongside other organizations and movements that are also organizing for Palestinian liberation. There's a lot more attention on the Palestinian prisoners. A lot of the prisoners' stories and names and faces have become very common, at least in a progressive environment, at least in a radical environment, at least in an environment where people are concerned about Palestine. People no longer suggest that the so-called two-state solution is an appropriate resolution to Zionist colonialism in Palestine, at least not, anyone who wants to reckon with the world seriously. I mean, certainly you hear this from, Biden or Trudeau, but at the same time, they're arming the Zionist regime. But you don't hear that from anyone who's actually interested in justice in Palestine. And that's something that's changed in the past 15 years. I'm not going to say that Samidoun changed that, because what changed it more than anything else is the work of the Palestinian resistance. But I will say that all of our organizations and movements have been a part of making that change happen, have been a part of the fact that right now, there are university students across the US, Canada, and around the world that identify with the Palestinian prisoners as not just leaders of the Palestinian resistance, but leaders of our international movement for justice and liberation. That the demonstrations that take place for Palestine and for Palestinian liberation put the support of the Palestinian resistance front and center, rather than being apologetic or trying to find an accommodation that will be acceptable to the very same forces that are sending the bombs and weaponry to slaughter Palestinians and engage in a genocide on a daily basis. And we've been a part of that. One of the things that we aim to do is to build a bridge between the Palestinian prisoners movement and the international movements for justice and liberation around the world. And I think that we have been doing that, and that has been a successful project. Because one of the things that the Zionist regime wants to do very much is to isolate the prisoners, not just physically, but also to isolate their ideas, to isolate their voices, to make them unknown, to make them unknowable. And by popularizing the prisoners, by sharing their writings, their expressions, their names, their stories, in a way that is directly aligned with their actual politics and their goals for the liberation of Palestine, we are part of working to break that isolation. And so we can never claim the victory, because the victory will always belong to the resistance and the people. But what we can do is be as much of a part of that as possible and do all of the work that we can to build an international popular cradle of the Palestinian resistance and of the resistance as a whole.
So let's talk about the attacks that Samidoun has faced. So before the October 7th Al-Aqsa flood operation by Palestinian resistance, Samidoun was not in the good graces of many of the Western imperial core governments. What attacks was Samidoun having to ward off in these times?
So this actually kind of directly connects to the answer to the last question about serving as a bridge between the Palestinian prisoners movement and the world and the progressive and anti-imperialist movements of the world more broadly, right? Because we're trying to amplify the voices of the Palestinian prisoners and to break their isolation and to build an international political and moral base of support for the Palestinian resistance. And I mean, just to be clear about this, the Palestinian resistance is comprehensive, right? Like, it includes everything from land defense to staying in your home and refusing to be kicked out to developing, frankly, healthcare and agricultural institutions to make sure that people have health and food sovereignty that can't be destroyed by the Zionist regime, to engaging in cultural production that preserves Palestinian culture and identity in the face of genocide. But first and foremost, when we're speaking about the Palestinian resistance in this context, we're speaking about the leadership of the Palestinian armed resistance, which is heavily criminalized by the Western imperialist powers and has been since its inception, because this is the mechanism of confrontation that is challenging and confronting and is like the tip of the spear confronting imperialism in Palestine and throughout the region. So when we're speaking about building popular support for the resistance, we're certainly speaking about building popular support for land defense, for a variety of Palestinian initiatives, but also building a base of moral and political support internationally for the Palestinian people and their armed struggle for the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. And as Samidoun, we are pretty direct and open about those political goals and objectives. Because if we're speaking about the Palestinian prisoners movement, of course, we're speaking about a diverse movement in the sense that people come from all factions. There are Palestinian prisoners from Fatah and from Hamas, from Islamic Jihad, from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. There are unaffiliated Palestinian political prisoners. There are Palestinian political prisoners who are children. There are Palestinian political prisoners who are student activists who are thrown in jail. There are currently nearly 4,000 Palestinians being held under administrative detention. That's when you're jailed with no charge, with no trial, for an indefinitely renewable period of time. And Palestinians have spent up to 12 years behind bars under administrative detention without ever being charged with anything. And this is in a context where merely being a member of a Palestinian political party or resistance organization is in and of itself the most common charge that Palestinians face within the Zionist occupation military courts. So this is like when they can't even bring any of those charges successfully. They engage in administrative detention. Now, but then at the same time, we're also speaking about hundreds of Palestinian prisoners who are held behind bars, who are serving life sentences. And they're serving life sentences because they were part of the armed resistance and they're part of the armed struggle. And their liberation is absolutely central to any project of liberating the Palestinian political prisoners. And that's why it's those prisoners who are on the top of the list when we hear the conversation that's happening right now about a prisoner exchange and an end to the genocide in Gaza. The prisoners that everyone is really working to ensure are liberated from the Zionist jails are those that they don't want to release, who are those with these very high sentences. So just to say that, like, as a prisoner solidarity organization, we would not be we would not be working in line with our existence and motivation if we did not center the Palestinian armed struggle in our communication, our advocacy, and our organizing. So with that being said, that's why we face the kind of attacks that we have. They can't throw us in administrative detention, right? They don't have the ability to do that. But what they do have the ability to do is engage in a series of political attacks and attempts at repression, and that we've seen this taking place in a number of countries, in a number of locations. Of course, it's escalated after October 7th, but it certainly existed before then. And this is because they don't want there to be a bridge from the Palestinian prisoners movement to the world internationally. This is something they would like to see cut off and stopped. And so that's why we see these kinds of repressive attacks. And so the kinds of things we saw before October 7th in 2021, in February, the Zionist regime itself, Benny Gantz, as then the Minister of Defense, signed off on us, designated us as a terrorist organization. And I mean, this is pretty egregious. I mean, of course, this is coming from a regime that says that, Ben and Jerry's choosing not to sell ice cream in settlements is a form of terrorism. So, I mean, obviously their definition of terrorism is quite outrageous. But at the same time, this was meant to not only inhibit the work of people organizing with Samidoun inside Palestine, but to create a sense of fear so that there would be this, essentially, people would be afraid to engage with Samidoun. Of course, in Germany, there had been repression that had been taking place for a long time. Anti-Palestinian repression in Germany certainly didn't begin with October 7th. It escalated and has become even worse. But in 2019 is when I would say there was a real escalation in existing kind of Zionist imperialist repression in Germany, specifically targeting the Palestinian community. It's also important to note that Germany is home to the largest Palestinian community in Europe, most of whom are Palestinian refugees from Lebanon and Syria who have been denied their right to return to Palestine for the past 76 years. Khalid, my husband, and I were both deported from Germany in 2019, largely because he was being targeted for his work and organizing with the Palestinian community in Berlin, speaking about politics, organizing demonstrations. We were then hit after leaving the country. We were temporary residents, and so we decided to come back to Canada, our country of citizenship. We were then hit with a 4-year ban from Europe. This meant that, like, in 2022, we were both refused entry into the Netherlands when we were traveling to go to a conference. And this, kind of got some attention at that time. This is, there's nothing unusual about this. In the 1970s and the 1980s, Palestinian leaders and spokespeople were being assassinated by Mossad agents in Europe. And they might feel that they don't have the ability to carry out those assassinations in the heart of the imperial core now. So instead of doing that, they engage in these series of pressure campaigns and attacks. And of course, Samidoun isn't alone in that regard. We can see this kind of targeting across the movement, especially when it comes to the forms of, like, defamation, media attacks, attempts to cut off fundraising. It was well before October 7th that we saw this very dedicated effort by Zionist organizations to attempt to prevent both us and our fiscal sponsor from engaging in any kind of online fundraising, usually by relying on the Zionist designation of Samidoun as a so-called terrorist organization in order to compel payment processors not to work with us and not to work with our fiscal sponsor and the hundreds of other organizations that they provide fiscal sponsorship services to. This is we see the use of, for example, websites like Canary Mission to defame students and professors who go out and speak for Palestine, to deny people jobs in their fields. And so this kind of like attempting to starve or cut off the funding to people and movements is certainly not unique to Samidoun, but we are an example in that category of that type of repression and of that type of attack. I guess I would also say in this context, like in the German context in particular, it's worth noting that it's been several years that Nakba Day marches have been banned in Germany. Palestinian Prisoners' Day marches have been banned in Berlin. Al-Quds Day has been banned in Berlin for a number of years. And so what we're seeing right now is just building on this entire atmosphere of anti-Palestinian repression, which has really escalated in Germany and has also come hand in hand with Germany's escalating role in NATO, its escalating role in supporting war in Ukraine. These two things have come hand in hand with one another. They're not separated because Nazism and fascism and anti-Semitism have been redefined as a problem of the Arab and Muslim communities, while also stigmatizing and engaging in very broad, very racist, really quite fascist and quite scary kind of propaganda targeting the community as a whole, while at the same time, what this actually serves to do is to give clearance to the actual fascist forces that are existing in Eastern Europe that Germany is in very close alliance with.
Let's talk about the impact of Samidoun, obviously in the context of the Palestinian resistance, in Canada specifically, because Zionists have been in a frenzy after Samidoun and yourself and Khaled Barakat for many years. So
Yes.
Canadians are probably going to want to know, what have you been up to?
I think our work is actually really public. We have active chapters of Samidoun in Toronto and in Vancouver. We have activists in Ottawa. We work with fellow organizers in Montreal and other cities. We organize demonstrations and protests. I mean, we didn't start organizing protests and demonstrations on October 7th. We just continued the work that we've been doing, just maybe with more intensity to try to match the intensity of the ongoing genocide targeting the Palestinian people in occupied Palestine. That we have been organizing teach-ins, doing political education, participating in direct actions and blockades, basically like whenever there's an opportunity to mobilize the public for Palestinian liberation and to stand against Canadian ongoing complicity in the genocide in occupied Palestine. And we have folks that are living in that area. Samidoun activists are there. We're protesting, we're demonstrating, we're organizing, we're engaging in public political activity. Now, there's a lot of organizations in Canada doing this work. Some Zionists seem to think that we're directing it all, which is a bit of an illusion, but we're always happy to work in coalition and in a collective sense with all of the organizations in this movement that are doing that work and that are doing that organizing. I mean, for example, I should just tell this story. At UBC, the University of British Columbia, there was one of the student encampments that have been part of this really growing student intifada movement across Canada, the United States, Europe, etc. And I was there along with a ton of other community activists for the first day of the encampment. This was a project that was led by UBC students and organized by UBC students and set up by UBC students. And, instead we had like Anthony Housefather and Marco Mendicino showing up outside the encampment, which I could only go to the first day because I was arrested and I had conditions that prohibited me from going to any assembly or rally or demonstration. So I couldn't even be at the encampment after the first day of the encampment. And we had these members of parliament from Montreal flying out to Vancouver to do a photo op in front of the encampment at UBC. Instead of taking, I mean, obviously I don't expect better from these particular MPs, but like instead of taking taking any time to actually listen to the students who were in the encampment behind them, who had a comprehensive set of demands regarding divestment and an end to Canadian complicity in genocide. They stood outside the encampment and started giving a talk about how Charlotte Kate set up the encampment. Like, this is also meant to really like kind of undermine the vast support for Palestine that actually exists across Canada and the vast opposition that exists to Canadian imperialism in the region, that they want to play that down by turning it into, something that Samidoun did or something that one organization did. And that's just not the way this movement has been. This has been a broad, diverse movement of organizations and individuals coming together to stand for Palestinian liberation. And Zionists want to do everything that they can to muddy the waters. We're very proud of the work that we do, and we're very committed to continuing to do it. But we know that we do that work as part of a collective space of organizing and not just on our own.
All right, Charlotte. So let's jump into the more present day. You were targeted by Vancouver police as part of a supposed hate crime investigation in April for a speech praising the Palestinian resistance October 7th Al-Aqsa flood operation. Victoria News says you were, quote, released on condition she not attend any protest rallies, assemblies until a court date on October 8th. That's or assemblies. Can you give the Canada Files audience an update on your case and how it has impacted your activism since April?
Sure. Well, I mean, just to say in the first place, the conditions that I'm under, we regard them as an egregious violation of charter rights, and also just as an attempt to essentially take activists and organizers off the scene by using conditions. There's nothing hateful about speaking positively about the Palestinian resistance. It's really quite the contrary. The Palestinian resistance and the resistance organizations, which the Canadian government continues to list as terrorist entities, despite the fact that they are engaging in a legal armed struggle, which is fully permitted under international law for people struggling to win their freedom from occupation and colonialism, including Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the resistance forces in Iraq, the government, the armed forces, and the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen. These resistance forces are actually, they're the forces of hope in the world today. Because when we look at the genocide, every day when people open up their phones and they scroll through a feed of children with their heads blown off, of bodies torn to pieces, of tents and refugee camps being bombed, and of an assortment of Canadian and US and European officials giving official statements in which they say Israel has the right to defend itself. This is an environment that can create a tremendous amount of just depression and disillusionment and nihilism. And it's the resistance that points toward the fact that, hey, we're not just heading towards death. There are actually movements that are organized, strategic movements that are fighting for their liberation and are winning victories, even in the face of the most extreme forms of violence and repression. When the Palestinian resistance carried out the Al-Aqsa flood operation on the 7th of October, it sent a very clear message that was obviously recognized by the imperialist forces and by the Zionist regime, that it was not just a dream. It was in fact a reality that Zionist colonialism could be defeated in Palestine and US imperialism could be kicked out of the region. And that, the Zionist entity is a temporary entity in the region. And these forces, these anti-human forces of plunder and profit and exploitation and colonialism saw the writing on the wall, and their response to that has not been to accept that there is no future for colonialism and the theft of people's land and resources in future, but instead to engage in a genocide. And so the continuing persistence of that resistance, the inability of the Zionist regime to wipe out the resistance after 11 months of genocide. Complete inability. They're facing new operations and new destructions of their tanks and personnel carriers on a daily basis in Gaza, not to mention the resistance that is blossoming in the West Bank and throughout the region as well. And the strong alliance between all of the resistance forces in the region, from Palestine to Lebanon to Yemen to Iraq to Syria to Iran and beyond, this is something that they are unable to accept. But it is actually probably the most powerful symbol, but also material reality of meaningful hope for the people of the world, that it is in fact possible to defeat these genocidal forces of imperialism, despite the horrific human cost that they exact on a daily basis from people. So, just to say, there's nothing hateful about speaking positively about Al-Aqsa flood and about October 7th. It's the opposite of hate. To speak positively about these things is a message of hope, of love, of the possibility of humanity to actually prevail against injustice and genocide and exploitation. And they want to take this and they want to criminalize it. Canada doesn't have what's called glorification of terror laws. We see those in Britain, we see those in France. Right now, there are hundreds of people in France literally facing police investigations and potential prosecutions for saying nothing more than that Palestinians have the right to resist occupation, and I support their armed struggle. There are, British activist Sarah Wilkinson, what is now being banned from social media. She had dozens of cops ransacking her house because they're accusing her of glorification of terrorism for reporting about the Palestinian resistance. British journalist Richie Medhurst was stopped and interrogated for 23 hours under the Terrorism Act for a similar thing. We don't have those laws in Canada, although there are Zionist organizations and various right-wingers that are trying to get glorification of terrorism laws adopted here. And if they can't do that, they want to bring it in under the cover of hate speech. But in order to accept that speaking positively about October 7th and the Al-Aqsa flood and the Palestinian resistance is a form of hate speech, then you have to accept all of the premises of Zionism. You have to accept the idea that the Zionist regime represents all Jewish people, and anyone who speaks about the resistance is, now is engaging in hateful language against Jewish people, despite only saying positive things about the Palestinian people and their resistance when they're speaking. It's you have to adopt the entire Zionist narrative. You have to believe that this genocidal regime occupying Palestine is now a representative of Jewish people. And I don't think that's a positive representation that anybody actually wants, other than Zionist organizations and imperialist forces that want to prevent any kind of challenge to ongoing domination and hegemony in Palestine and throughout the region. So they're trying to get in glorification of terrorism laws and this kind of complete violation of charter rights under the cover of so-called hate speech laws. And this is a danger that everyone should be concerned about, whether you personally want to go to a rally and give a speech about the righteousness of the October 7th operation and the legitimacy of the Palestinian and Lebanese armed resistance. You should recognize, everyone should recognize, that these kinds of attacks are an attempt to fundamentally prevent anyone from voicing an objection to Zionist and imperialist hegemony, from voicing the possibility that it's possible for these forces to be defeated, and that in fact they are on the road to defeat now.
Thanks, Charlotte. So I think the obvious thing, and it's, well, what doesn't trigger a meltdown in terms of your actions from the Zionist crowd, but we really saw them kick off again because you were in Iran recently. You received a human rights award from the Iranian government. So what was the process of winning that award? And then what was your experience in Iran? Because I saw in the Zionist media that you did some interviews, right?
Yes, I did a lot of interviews. Well, first of all, it was an honor to receive this award. I considered it, in many ways a collective award for the work of Samidoun as an organization that's happening internationally. And I should note that like Samidoun has an active chapter in Iran as well. It was a surprise to me. It was a huge honor. I received an email, with this information. I was very excited to accept it and to participate in this event. And it was, an honor to be recognized alongside the people that I was recognized alongside. And I didn't consider it like as a personal thing, but as, a recognition for the work that Samidoun is doing. But more than that, around the kind of issue of the internationalization of the Palestinian prisoners movement and the struggle of the Palestinian people, particularly for the liberation of Palestinian political prisoners. And I was there for a very short period of time. I wish I could have stayed for longer. But we participated in a series of media interviews with a variety of Iranian TV shows and newspapers and websites and media outlets across the board, some of which were about the kind of repression that the Palestine movement is facing internationally in Germany and Canada and France and Britain and the United States, and the ways in which the imperialist powers are violating the human rights of the Palestinian people, of course, first and foremost, by directly participating in the genocide through sending weapons and armaments, and not to mention even, vetoing resolutions in the United Nations to bring the genocide to an end, but also by it's also participation in genocide to suppress the movements that are fighting against genocide, both in Palestine and in their countries. And that's one of the ways that the imperialist powers are engaging in this kind of direct complicity. So this is one of the topics that was very popular. I also had the opportunity to participate in some meetings. One meeting that took place at a study center associated with the Iranian parliament, one of which took place with a number of women's organizations talking about the situation of Palestinian women prisoners. It was honestly like an extremely packed 3 days of meetings and interviews. And it was an honor to be there. And I was very happy to be part of I was very happy to be in Iran, which is part of this camp of resistance that is confronting imperialism and Zionism in Palestine and in the region, and to speak together with people that, frankly, the US and its imperialist partners, including in Canada, want to prevent from happening. And they want to demonize Iran to promote this ongoing war drive, the ongoing use of sanctions, of illegitimate, unilateral, economic coercive measures that are meant to try to starve the Iranian people and government into submission and concession to imperialist demands and hegemony, something that's absolutely not going to happen. And so, yes, clearly, Zionist organizations and corporate media in Canada were quite incensed about this fact, because they don't want to see those barriers broken down. They want to just promote a war drive. They want to promote war on Iran. They want to promote, they want to give people a false sense of reality and have people, have people confused about what's actually taking place. And the fact that right now it is the US and its allies, primarily the Zionist regime, that are the greatest threat to peace and security of humanity in the region and in the world. And so it's absolutely critical that we break down those lies and we break down those barriers, perhaps now more than ever before.
Right. So I think this Samidoun chapter in Iran is a very interesting thing to me. I certainly wasn't aware of it, and I don't think a lot of the Can Files audience would be, because I think Iran's role in the Palestinian resistance is the acts of resistance really is poorly misunderstood. Now, we don't have time for a whole chat in the history of that. However, Samidoun's Iran chapter, can you tell us a little bit about their activities, like the history of them?
Well, sure. I mean, they're a chapter of our international organization, and that engages in just, even in countries that are part of the resistance front, it's important for people to have a way to engage in political activities and knowing about the prisoners and learning more about Palestine, and doing producing educational materials, sharing books and information. I mean, the Samidoun chapter in Iran, they most recently they sent a bunch of information and materials and information like packets, books, stickers about Palestine to pilgrims who were participating in the Arba'in Walk in Iraq. They engage in, Farsi language media work, doing teach-ins and educational events. Like students in Iran that want to participate in supporting Palestine, right? Like they don't have to face, administrations that want to shut them down and that are investing in Zionist colonialism, but people still want to like participate with one another, go to demonstrations, hold the Palestinian flag, advocate for Palestinian prisoners, create new writing and materials that's available. And those are the kinds of things that Samidoun Iran works on and is able to do.
So I want to leave this episode off with this question. How do you think Canadians standing in solidarity with Palestinian liberation should escalate their protests to oppose Canada's continuing support for the Zionist regime?
There's a few kinds of escalation, and I think all of them are really important because one of the things that we've seen has been an escalation, for example, in direct actions that are confronting the war machine head on. So, for example, there was a protest in Vancouver area just the other day, which shut down a Maersk facility. Maersk is a global shipping giant that has shipped hundreds of millions of dollars of US weaponry around the world just since October of 2023. And they're one of the targets of kind of an international campaign to boycott them and to hold them accountable for this. This blockade that took place cost Maersk between $125,000 to $500,000. And this was just something that was carried out by activists in one morning. We see examples like of what's happening with Palestine Action in Britain, who are also facing right now a really intensified and extreme level of repression, who have shut down at least two Elbit systems, the Israeli war manufacturer that makes 85% of the armed drones, which are what the Zionist regime typically uses for its assassination operations and has been using to murder people in Gaza and the West Bank on a consistent and regular basis. They've shut down two of their facilities through their ongoing direct actions. This is not to mention the pressure that can be put on Scotiabank and these other kinds of complicit corporations. Scotiabank is still, even after their two successive divestments from Elbit stock, they're still one of the top 10 global investors in Elbit Systems, which is literally the company that this is what they do. They make 85% Zionist entities armed drones that are used to shoot Palestinians dead and to slaughter them in the ongoing genocide. So right now, Scotiabank is probably the leading example of a Canadian bank that is investing directly in the genocide of the Palestinian people. So Scotiabank is a key target for protest, for divestment, for direct action. We have places like Indigo, the largest Canadian chain bookstore in Canada, which has recently gone private. And Indigo's CEO is also runs this so-called charity called the Heseg Foundation for Lone Soldiers, which essentially convinces people around the world, including Canadians, to go enlist as so-called lone soldiers in the Israeli occupation forces, and then provides them with educational benefits and resources to encourage them to enlist in a foreign army. This is still being recognized as a charitable organization by the Canada Revenue Agency. This is Canada's largest chain bookstore. There are people in Toronto who put up posters outside an Indigo building, and they're trying to charge them with hate crimes too, because they postered a building of a corporation, a massive corporation in Canada, whose CEO is also running a charity that's working to send so-called lone soldiers to participate in a genocide. So there are these major targets, not to mention Boeing facilities, Lockheed Martin facilities, whether people are confronting their politicians, shutting down, engaging in direct actions to directly confront the war machine, keeping up the protest movements, keeping the streets full of people, because the fact is that that's not enough. Keeping the streets full of people is not enough, but it's still necessary to keep it going on. If we look at the example of Yemen, for example, which has played such a leading role, the Port of Eilat had to declare bankruptcy, and they've been shutting down the Red Sea as a supply line of genocide. at the same time, the Yemeni masses come out in millions every single Friday. And so that's like the least that we can do, is to continue to come out and to fill the streets and to make it impossible to carry on business as usual. We're heading back to another school year, another university year. And it's clear that the student movement is not just going to sit back and accept this idea that, oh, the encampments are a thing of the past, and that you should move on, when there's still an ongoing genocide in Palestine, and these universities are still repressing their students while at the same time investing in the genocide that is taking place, and being part and parcel of the imperialist system and of particularly the Zionist project in occupied Palestine. And of course, I think it's also our responsibility to engage in political escalation and not to back off. The attempts to One of the reasons why they engage in these kinds of repression and these kinds of defamation campaigns is to try to compel people to be too afraid or intimidated to speak openly about the Palestinian armed resistance, to call, and I mean, this is a key demand, to call for getting these organizations from the PFLP to Hezbollah to Hamas to Islamic Jihad off the so-called terrorist entities list that Canada has. These are not terrorist organizations. These are freedom fighters. They are engaging in a struggle for national liberation. They have every right to do so. And these organizations are heroes to people around the world, and there's no reason why they should be listed as so-called terrorist organizations. And it's absolutely incumbent upon us to speak clearly about that and say these organizations have got to get off this list.
All right, Charlotte, thank you very much there. I'm going to leave it there for this episode of the Canada Files Speaker Series. We spoke with Charlotte Cates. She is the International Coordinator of the Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network. Charlotte, how can people keep up with the work of Samidoun and perhaps of yourself?
Sure. Well, please visit our website at samidoun.net. That's SAMIDOUN.net. Or you can follow us on Telegram at Samidoun Network. You can follow us on Twitter at Samidoun PP for Samidoun Palestinian Prisoners. Follow us at these locations. Don't hesitate to send us an email, send us a message. We're always interested in working together with people, in participating in alliances, and participating in mutual educational events, and joining demonstrations and speaking at things. And if you're interested in becoming a member of Samidoun, reach out to us as well, because we'd love for more people to get involved in building this movement to make us stronger and collectively more united for the liberation of Palestine.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. That's the end of the Speaker Series episode. CanFL's viewers, if you want to support this journalism, please do set up a monthly or annual donation. Goodbye, everyone.